Hi everybody, this is the Doo Wop worksheet. So what is Doo Wop? Well, let's talk about number one. The most important fundamentals of Doo Wop are rhythm and harmony. This is music that really features harmony, 4 or 5 voices with different vocal ranges. So you have someone has a very low note, someone has a very high note, and you find people that have voices that sort of match that, and then they blend. And this is a music that really highlights the blending of the human voice, which when it works is some blend of science because of the frequencies that match and just pure hair-raising beauty, aesthetic beauty that's hard to explain. It just works when you hear it. So that's number one. The term doo-wop comes from these nonsense syllables that are used in a lot of the song lyrics. And what it does is it creates the illusion of a drum. So a lot of this music is a cappella. It doesn't have backgrounds. It may have a bass player or a guitar player playing behind it, but ultimately it's just 5 people. And it's singing in a chamber of some sort, a subway or a hallway where the echo is natural. And this gives life to the music. So a lot of songs, for instance, this Tommy Edwards song really went nowhere and then came back re-released in the 1950s with doo-wop syllables behind it, and all of a sudden was a #1 record. Doo-wop first appeared on the pop charts in the 1950s, the early 1950s. And interestingly enough, was the first music that was marketed as rock and roll. This was Alan Freed's introduction of African American music to primarily Caucasian teenagers in the New York market. Number 4, most doo-wop groups appeared on the pop charts only once, and this is called a one-hit wonder. So this is really the land of one-hit wonders, just because of the chicanery, if you will, of really manipulating young singers. If you think about someone who is 15 years old, the copyright is 70 years after their death. So the younger the artist, the longer you own the copyright. And if you get someone to sign the copyright over without really knowing about it for a weekly contract, and they didn't realize that they were signing away 70 years plus their life. Number 5, the use of the bass singer. Ba-ba-do-do-do. Ba-do. This really was not the normal part of doo-wop or vocal harmony, but this 1950 song by the Ravens called Count Every Star really cemented this style. So you won't hear this bass happening all the time, but if it's there, it really is the influence. And I would say from the early Mills Brothers as well, which we'll talk about. Now, the interesting thing about doo-wop songs is that they could be upbeat, or it could be a ballad. A ballad is a slow song, and really this music was make-out music for teenagers. I mean, this was the real appeal to this. There was a new sense of optimism in the 1950s post-war. There were teenagers who were getting allowances, whose parents were letting them use their cars, and they were parking and steaming up the windows in Lover's Lane. So this was the music of eventually what became known as the baby boomers. The peak years of doo-wop was really the early 1960s, before the appearance of the Beatles. The biggest of these groups with their own Broadway show and movie, Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. But we have to remember that if you're going to call Motown doo-wop, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Shop Around, Mary Wells, My Guy, this all preceded the Beatles. Doo-wop bands are often named after cars and birds for some reason. So the Ravens, the Crows, the Falcons, the Eagles were a doo-wop band before the band in the 70s somehow finagled the name. And then, of course, the Impalas and the Cadillacs and the Fleetwoods. And you might wonder, well, how would it work today? You know, the Teslas, that could be very nice. But the Hyundais, the Kias, I don't know. You would pick a car that was really had muscle or had some sort of elegant reputation. Number 9. The style became a natural for pop groups when producers decided to put a band behind the singers. So really, this whole style that you see today with BTS or One Direction, or if you go back to NSYNC, Backstreet Boys, is really doo-wop with a band added. And so if you don't have a band, we call it a cappella. But this music, whether you see a band or not, this music is very connected to its street origins. Its origins of 4 or 5 vocal harmonies blending together. An important root group of this style were the Mills Brothers in the 1940s. I can just tell you that from my dad's perspective, growing up in World War II as a teenager, the only group he really knew about, African American, was the Mills Brothers. His thing was Glenn Miller and Harry James and Tommy Dorsey. Doo-wop groups started on street corners in large northern cities like New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore. So it is an urban style, and it still is. And of course, the subway or the housing project stairways, these were great places to rehearse. But then the places to perform and be noticed were on street corners where producers would walk by and notice 4 or 5 young kids and say, wow, these kids are great, they're good looking, let's put a band behind them. And it became part of this very large studio system where there were studio bands and arrangers and composers, and you just needed the kids. You just needed kids to sell music to kids. So this is why we see 1956 as being important for Elvis, but also being important for doo-wop groups like Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. Number 12, groups like the Temptations added dancing. Well, it's kind of a natural to add dancing if you think about it, because you're just standing there on a street corner, but to have coordinated, synchronized steps that somehow emphasized what was going on in the background and also complemented the background parts. So Gladys Knight and the Pips, many of these people have been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So number 13, this style of music has led to boy bands and girl groups. So if we give an example, BTS is a boy band. The girls pick out their favorite, there's dancing, and there's harmony. Now whether they're doing doo-wop or not is another story, whether they're actually doing doo-wop in its purest form, whether they're using nonsense syllables, that's debatable. But if you take Destiny's Child as an example for a girl group, and the girl groups, of course, the influence of the Shirelles, the Chiffons, all those sort of nameless girl groups from the 50s, and then leading into Diana Ross and the Supremes and Gladys Knight and the Pips and that kind of thing. Now, for us to name some doo-wop groups, well, I'm going to show you some examples. And what we'll notice about doo-wop, it's very much like soul music and rap. Different cities produce different kinds of doo-wop. So Chicago produced different than New York, than Philly, than Los Angeles. So we'll give you some examples of some of the 50s, 60s, and 70s styles. And I should mention that there are many, many groups that still go on, because you'll see these, say for instance on PBS when they're fundraising, you'll see that the groups all seem very old now, but you have to imagine them as being teenagers and the energy that they created as teenagers, not just to raise money for PBS. That is your doo-wop worksheet. Thank you. See you soon.